The pivot is the entry in the Simplex tableau around which we try to simplify the matrix. And we choose it in a really specific way. So in order to choose the pivot, we first choose the column with the most negative indicator. And the indicator row is the row that contains the coefficients of the objective function. So that's the final row in the matrix. So we choose the column with the most negative indicator. -3 is the most negative number, so that means that we are looking in the x3 column. Once we've selected the column, we then compute the quotients for that pivot column. So this selected column, we call it the pivot column. We calculate quotients by dividing entries in the final column by entries in that pivot column. So let's calculate the quotients. So the first quotient, we divide 100 by 2 to get 50. Second quotient, we divide 210 by 2 to get 105. And last quotient, we divide 150 by 1 to get 150. And now we choose the row that has the smallest quotient. So the smallest quotient happened here, because 50 is the smallest of those quotient numbers. So what that means is that this number is the pivot. It occurs in the column with the most negative indicator of -3, and it occurs in the row with the smallest quotient out of that column. So now we'll use this example and we'll show how to pivot around that 2 in the constraint 1 x3 column spot. So after selecting the pivot, which we selected as this entry in the first row in the x3 spot, we want to work on that pivot. And the process for pivoting involves performing row operations to turn that pivot number into a 1, and then performing row operations to turn every other entry in the pivot column to a 0. So in order to turn that entry into a 1, we need to take row 1 and multiply it by 1/2. So that's going to be our first step, is multiplying row 1 by 1/2, which will give us the matrix 1/2, 1/2, 1, 1/2, 0, 0, 0, 50. And then that's just the first row changed. Every other row remains the same. So 2, 3, 2, 0, 1, 0, 0, 210, 5, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 150, -2, -1, -3, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. Okay, so that is obtained by multiplying row 1 by 1/2. And now in our pivot spot, we have a 1. So that's the first step of pivoting. Now the next step is to change all of the other entries into zeros in that column. So we want to turn this 2 into a 0. We want to turn this 1 into a 0, and we want to turn this -3 into a 0. And we can do that in whichever order we choose. It would be easiest, I think, to turn this 1 into a 0. So our first row operation could be to replace row 3, because this is now our row 3. So now row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4. We replace row 3 with row 3 minus row 1. So that would give us 5 minus 1/2 in that spot. So that would be 4.5 or 9/2. And 1 minus 1/2 in the next spot, which would be just 1/2. 1 minus 1 is 0. 0 minus 1/2 is negative 1/2. 0 minus 0 is 0. 1 minus 0 is 1. 0 minus 0 is 0. And 150 minus 50 is 100. So that's our new row 3. And then we rewrite everything else. So 1/2, 1/2, 1, 1/2, 0, 0, 0, 50. 2, 3, 2, 0, 1, 0, 0, 2, 10. And then row 4 is negative 2, negative 1, negative 3, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. So that's our next step in the matrix. So now recall that the column that we're working in is this column. This is our pivot column. We have the one that we want in the pivot spot, and now we're trying to turn the other entries into zeros. So our next step would be to turn this 2 into a 0, and also to turn this negative 3 into a 0. We'll show those row operations in a simpler matrix, but this is the idea of performing a pivot. So get a 1 in the pivot spot and zeros elsewhere in the column. After that, we choose a new pivot and repeat the same process again.